Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. What I want to show you is that, number one, to put it bluntly, everyone already knows that God exists. Now, they would not say that, and I don't think they even believe that, a lot of people. They would say, I know no such thing. But what we're trying to show, in a different way than most people have heard, is that they do know God exists because they cannot account for what they might consider to be self-evident truths without Him. I'll go ahead and tell you what those are, and then we'll review just a little bit about the first one and move on to the second one. The first thing that I would say is that anybody that brings any argument to the table must use logic. And so what I want to show is that we all use it in every conversation we have. It's this and not that. It makes sense. It doesn't make sense. But the validity of logic cannot be justified unless God exists. The second thing that I want to show, and what we'll talk about today, are the laws of science, how science operates. We're going to entitle this program, Can Science Operate or Function Without God? I don't think it can. And the assumption that the universe is all there is, everything's matter and must be explained materially, just absolutely fails regarding science. It eliminates the very thing that it's trying to operate. And then the third area, of course, would be morality. That's in a little different category. In the sense that we don't have to obey morality, moral laws. We all obey the law of gravity. We all obey the physical laws. We don't consciously obey them, we're just subject to them. So those three areas are the things that I want to talk about, and I'll give you a little review to try to make this clear to you. This is something that most people have not encountered. And so as you listen to this, it might be, at first you might be saying, what's he saying here? What's exactly that he wants to talk about? But once it becomes clear to you, I think it will be crystal clear. So again, thanks so much for watching, and stay with us. So I've mentioned the idea of logic. What is logic? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary, it just says it's the rules by which we can apply sound thinking, reasonable thinking, to any area of knowledge. And that's what we do, of course, and we just assume, and this is, I've never heard anybody try to justify their use of logic, or the reason they are using logic, but the truth is they have no justification for it. To explain this to you, I want to give you a diagram, something you can look at. A person that wants to say or show that God doesn't exist, an atheist, the battle's not really between atheism and theism or belief in God. The battle is really between naturalism, the idea that nothing exists except the physical universe, and everything else, any form of knowledge. including theism. And what I want to show you is, and I'll use a diagram to do it, but what I want to show you is that the naturalist basically says, I'm using a non-material, a metaphysical process called logic to show you that nothing metaphysical or non-material exists. Well, obviously, I think now you're starting to see that just doesn't work. So imagine a diagram, if you will, a very simple diagram, just with a T, like a T. You've got one side and the other side. On the left side at the top, we'll put the word the universe or all matter. If you want to extend that to time, space, and energy, that's fine. Pretty much everybody agrees that all those things came into existence at the same point. So the first thing we'd want to say that we all agree on about the universe is that it's finite. That is, it had a beginning. And of course, if you follow the laws of science, it will have an end. Everything will die in the end. Also with that, you would say that nature, which describes the way that this material universe works, has no purpose or plan to it. You'd also say, and I think you'd get universal agreement on this, that nature has no knowledge. It has no plan, it has no direction, it has no purpose. It's just whatever is regarding nature. Now let's go to the other side of the diagram, and we'll call it the metaphysical realities. Now, of course, the naturalist wants to say that doesn't exist. But if it's metaphysical and non-material, it could be infinite. It doesn't have to be limited to time. It doesn't have to be limited to space. It doesn't have to be limited to, there's no weight, you can't measure it. It's just a metaphysical concept or whatever, really, that's not physical. Now, where would you put, let's say, what's logic? Again, the rules of sound thinking. And my question is, on which side of that diagram, it has to be physical or non-physical, it has to be material or immaterial or metaphysical, which side would you put logic on in the diagram? Now there's one thing I sort of left out of this diagram so far because I think it's maybe the most potent statement I can make. The other thing that we would all agree on about the physical universe is that it's constantly changing. I think you'd agree with that. Certainly scientists would agree with that. The universe is not static. It's constantly changing. Now, again, let's go back to logic, the rules of sound thinking. Again, the atheist comes to the table and he says, look, I've looked at the evidence. I have used logic and reason to determine that there's nothing that exists that's immaterial. Certainly God would be in that equation. But wait a minute. He says he's using logic. He thinks he's a logical thinker. What about logic itself? If the universe is all that is, then if logic is a part of just of matter of that universe, wouldn't it mean that logic is always changing too? And wouldn't that mean that whatever is logical today, there's no reason on that basis to believe that it will be logical tomorrow? But nobody lives like that. My point is that nobody can live out logically this idea that nothing exists except the physical universe. And if logic is indeed sound thinking, good thinking, there has to be a sound mind behind it. If logic is perfectly sound, then there has to be a perfect mind behind it. I haven't heard anyone that's able to justify his use of logic without God. On the other hand, if God exists and logic is just a reflection of his character, as is morality, then it's perfectly normal to say that logic is self-evident in that God is self-evident. And that's what the scriptural claim is, that God has made himself evident, that everyone knows that God is that he exists, and they suppress that knowledge. They built up a case. But here's the big point. I think it can be shown that any worldview that leaves out God will end up being self-contradictory and lead to absurdities if you follow them to their logical conclusions. So we have these really wonderful, unchanging things that we take for granted, might be the best way to put it in more common language, that truth is true. But how can that be in a universe that's constantly changing, and everyone agrees that the physical universe is just constantly changing. I don't see any way to justify the use of logic if it's part of that universe. And if it's not part of that universe, there has to be a metaphysical reality. And again, if logic is sound thinking, there has to be a mentality behind it, and that helps everything to fall into place, really. C.S. Lewis said it this way, and I like this. He said, the naturalists have explained away explanation itself. And I think that's a very accurate statement. There's no knowledge apart from God. There's no knowledge apart from some basis on which to find and claim to know any knowledge at all, if these things are just constantly changing. The same thing can be true, what we're talking about today is science. The same thing is true about even scientific laws. How is it if, let's say, the law of gravity is describing how matter reacts and what happens when objects fall and how they pull towards each other and so forth? How is it if that law and that value is just a part of the matter, just a part of the relationship of material to each other? If that's true, how can it be the same? Because everything it describes is constantly changing. If it's a part of what it describes, then it's constantly changing. It's like the naturalists want to make Shakespeare an actor in his own play. Well, he's not in the play. You can't find Shakespeare in Hamlet. You can certainly find evidence for him in Hamlet, but he's not a character in the play. He's not a prop. He's not an actor even. He's outside of the play, and yet he's the author of the play. That's a pretty good illustration, I think, of what I'm trying to illustrate here. The same thing is absolutely true about truth itself. The laws of logic are, think about this, they're inescapable. The basic law of logic is called the law of non-contradiction. It just means if this is true, then the opposing statement can't be true at the same time and in the same place and in the same way. You can't say God exists and God does not exist and they're both be true. One of them has to be true and one of them has to be false. We use that all the time. Ask your kid if he did his homework. And if he either did or he didn't, no matter what he says. So that's the way we operate. When I say that the laws of logic are inescapable, one of the things that sometimes you'll hear is, no, there's Eastern and Western logic, but there's really not. If it's true, it's not false. If it's false, it's not true. That's just the basic rule of logic. One of the most, and this is my point here that I want to make from that, one of the most common, maybe the most common objection to Christianity that you hear today is one of the most illogical and uninformed. Maybe more well-meaning people will say to me, it's very difficult for them to understand how that we believe that Christianity and Jesus in particular is the only way to be reconciled to God. Well, the obvious answer is nobody else did what Jesus did. Why is it exclusive or arrogant for me to take from Jesus what nobody else is offering, that being eternal life as a gift? But more than that, all we're saying when we talk about Christianity, or when a Hindu talks about Hinduism, a Buddhist about Buddhism, or even a Muslim about Islam, is we're saying that it's actually true whether I believe it or not. Now, that seems so logical to me that to object to that would be the opposite. It would be very illogical to object to that. Now, you may think it's false, and that's fine. If that's the position you want to take, then we can deal with it on an evidential basis, which is more likely to be true and which not. But the objection itself, there can't only be one way to heaven. It just doesn't, it's illogical. It's well-meaning because we don't want to exclude people, but the truth is the truth. And that's all we're saying. We're not being intolerant of people's right to believe other things any more than somebody can believe 1 and 1 equals 3 if they want. But by the very nature of truth, if you say that the law of non-contradiction is untrue, you've just affirmed it because you've disagreed with it. If a person says it can't be true, Are you seeing here what he says? It can't be true that Christianity is the only way. Think what he's just said. He's just disagreed with the position you've taken. And if he says you're arrogant and intolerant for taking it as a Christian, then he's doing exactly what he's accusing you of doing. He's disagreeing with you. He's saying his position is right and your position is wrong. Doesn't make sense. Here's a statement that I want to make that I think is very indicative of what we want to say. The naturalist who says there's nothing in the metaphysical world, God doesn't exist, here's I think the most damaging idea. He actually has to borrow from the Christian worldview that there are unchanging metaphysical realities. He has to borrow from that worldview even to argue against it. Stephen Hawking made the most outrageous statement in his latest book, The Grand Design, that I've heard in a long time, and of course he was taken to task by his own group for it. He made the statement, philosophy is dead. Well, he can't even make that statement without philosophy, without using the law of non-contradiction. He's disagreeing with a host of people when he says that, and so he's saying my truth, the thing that I believe is true, is closer to reality than what you're saying. Well, so philosophy obviously is not dead. He can't get along without it. Science itself, to say that science is the only way that we can know anything, you know what the word science means? It means knowledge. So to say that science is the only way we can know anything is the same as saying knowledge is the only way we can know anything. So there again, it's just, all these things are inescapable. Here's a summary statement that I think you can hang on to. The reason that the Bible says that God is self-evident is because that there are unchanging, immaterial, or metaphysical, and just short hop to say spiritual, realities that we all take for granted, but we cannot justify in a naturalistic universe without God. So, despite what Dr. Hawking is saying about philosophy being dead, his whole book and all the science that he has done, some of it really marvelous through the years, is based on a philosophical principle. Matter of fact, science is based on the philosophical principle that we call causation. It simply means that every event must have a cause. Now, by the way, you can't prove that in a laboratory. You say, well, every event that we've looked at in the laboratory has had a cause. Exactly. It's still an assumption to say that every event, that we can't possibly look at every event nor predict the future unless there is a fixed law, philosophical truth that says every event, everything that has a beginning must have a cause. You've heard me say that a lot on this program. So science can't operate without philosophy. Philosophy can't operate without God. It can't justify itself. You can't justify anything metaphysical or unchanging or intelligent, which logic is, philosophy is, without God. That's the point. You can't do that. Let's look at this principle of causation. What causes a rainbow? Isaac Newton explained what causes a rainbow. He says it's light going through a natural prism. Now, of course, he did experiments to prove that. But the light going through the prism is not the primary cause of the rainbow. Where does the light come from? Well, it comes from energy that's made by the sun. In this case, there could be other sources of light, but even that's not the primary cause. The sun is made of matter. So the primary cause of the energy that creates the light that goes through the prism, I feel like I'm singing a song here, that creates the rainbow, that's what we constantly ask. What caused this? You go back another step, what caused this? Until you get to the primary cause of everything. What caused matter? And here again, science by itself, without God, has no real explanation for that. I think that's so critical. I think that's so impressive. I just think that's so easy, really. that when you come to a primary cause, the absolute primary cause for anything that is unchanging, like the philosophical principle, everything needs a cause, then if you don't have God, you have nowhere to go. You end up with a blind faith in a metaphysical principle that you don't even believe in. So how can science operate without those? I feel like I need to reiterate just a little bit this. Again, I want it to be clear, because once it falls into place, it just really gets very clear. And it's that you can't have a naturalistic, materialistic, nothing metaphysical universe and make sense of anything. You always have to go back to, science is looking for the theory of everything now. I think that's what Stephen Hawking is all about, and more power to him. But God is the theory of everything. And I hope that makes sense to you. And that's why he's so self-evident, that he is the primary cause of unchanging things. Now, you can certainly use secondary causes. Nature would be a secondary cause, but it has no explanation for itself, especially given the fact that it's governed, if that's a loose term, I think, but it's governed by scientific or natural laws that are unchanging. So again, the laws themselves can't be part of the universe that they're describing. The logic that's used to put 1 and 1 together and get 2 is not a part of the numbers. I know that I'm repeating some of these ideas, I hope not too much over and over again, but I just want them to become very clear to you. And as I said, once they do, I think these things will fall into place. We can't live without some unchanging truths. Those are contained in, sometimes they're called self-evident truths. They need no justification, but the reason they don't is because they're a reflection of God. If God does not exist, then in a naturalistic universe, a materialistic universe, there is no justification for anything unchanging. I mean, look around you in the shot here. You're seeing a beautiful, beautiful spot that is a part of the natural universe, and we enjoy that. And it looks like it's been here forever and will be here forever, but we know that's not the case. Even as we speak, everything around us is changing. The rocks are eroding. The trees are dying. That's impossible to square with anything that's unchanging, again, in an atheistic view. So again, not only does atheism have to borrow from an unchanging metaphysical reality, which is biblical, the biblical worldview. I want you to understand that. That's the Christian or the biblical worldview. That God is the theory of everything, that everything that's unchanging is a reflection of either His character or His command. And you certainly put logic in that category, the laws of science and nature, and as we'll see on the next program, the laws of morality as well. What we've tried to show here is that nothing can justify itself without God. That's why I think the scriptures teach in Romans 18, or Romans 1:18 through about 25, that God is self-evident. He's made Himself known. And the specific 3 ways in which God has made Himself known is that He is outside of His creation. That means He's timeless, which means eternal. He's all-powerful, which means He has the actual power of causation to make everything, to create everything out of nothing. And I think the naturalist is left with nothing to explain. And if you keep going back, as we talked about with the illustration of the rainbow, that's what happens. What caused the rainbow? Light through a prism. What caused the light? The sun's energy. What caused the energy? Matter. What caused the matter? That's where the explanation stops, unless you have a creator. There's no explanation for it, and they'll tell you that. They admit that. Well, why not take the self-evidence of God as the theory of everything? The same thing is true about science. It's based on a philosophical principle that is unchanging, and yet it describes a universe, a beautiful natural scene that we're looking at here, where everything is changing. So if it's a part of that universe, if it's a part of that nature, then it has to change too. You couldn't predict the future by the past, because everything might change. Your laws of logic, your valid reasoning, you couldn't count on it being the same day after day, week after week, month after month. That's why I think when Paul went to Athens to speak to his philosophical counterparts, the Mac Daddies, if you will, of philosophy of those days, the Greeks, he said to them, it's in God that we live and breathe and move and have our being. God is self-evident. I think honestly that we know that down deep in our hearts, even though if on an intellectual basis we formulated an argument against God, we have to borrow from the unchangeableness of God and His character to even do that. Thanks so much for watching. Church for Skeptics began in January of 2003. As far as I know, it's the only program that focuses on giving reasonable answers for skeptical people regarding the Christian faith that's on a non-religious network. If this program is helping you better understand the claims of Jesus Christ, please consider helping us continue this work by sending a tax-deductible contribution. You can send a check made out to Educare to the following address with Church for Skeptics on the memo line. Thanks very much for your consideration.